Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Logos for episode 31 of the Church Fathers, dialogue with Trypho, chapters 71 to 80. So, chapter 71, Justin claims that the Jews rejected the translation of the 70. So, those are the Septuagint, which sept means 70, was the idea that there were 70 Jews who were taken by one of the Ptolemies, king of Egypt, to translate the Bible into Greek. And according to legend, they all translated it the same way. I'm somewhat dubious of that, but that doesn't mean it's not a valuable translation nonetheless. And he claims that the Jews took scriptures out of the canon that prophesies of the virgin conceiving is not Hezekiah but Christ. Sorry, two separate points. Took scriptures out of the canon, and then two, he argues that the prophecy concerning the virgin is not about Hezekiah but Christ. And then Trypho says, what scriptures have the Jews canceled? And then, we just lost it. 72. Where were we? Here we go. Yeah. No, wait, that's 82. We want 72. There we go. Justin cites Esdras. There were two books of Esdras, both of which are accepted by Rome in the East, which argues that those who reject Christ will be a laughingstock. Justin quotes Jeremiah 11:19 to make a familiar point. Interesting footnote here. It is not known where this passage comes from, and the passage in question is, but if you will not believe him and will not listen to his declarations, you shall be a laughingstock to the nations. So again, we already have a track record that either Justin himself or whoever interpreted this text is not great with his Old Testament. We covered that 3 or 4 episodes ago. So this isn't necessarily surprising, but I think what is surprising is, and further evidence, Logos, of your position that this was a hypothetical dialogue, is that Trypho just doesn't come back with a checkmate, because if this was just made up, a real-life Jew would have totally called that out.
Yeah,
Logos.
I agree.
Okay. 73. Justin claims that this line from the 95th Psalm, from the wood, was taken out by the Jews when in fact it was added by the Christians. See, this is confusing, right? Because again, footnote, these words were not taken away by the Jews, but added by some Christians, auto, and then bracket, a statement not proved, bracket. So it's like a meta commentary on the commentary. It's like Justin said you added it. Otto says the Christians added it. No, the Jews took it out. Otto says the Christians added it. And then the translator, Philip Schaff, says a not proven statement. So it's like, I think at this point I'm like you with Moldbug, Logos. I'm confused.
Yeah, I just know it's a pretty big accusation. I'm trying to follow the accusation because maybe there's something I'm missing here. But it sounds to me like Justin is accusing this new translation, which happened a while ago, of translating out certain verses which would be amenable to prophecies of Christ before they even knew there was going to be a Christ. Because like the 70 happened like well before Christ, did it? Or was this like...
No, yeah, it was well before Christ.
So how would they have known which verses to take out that were going to point to Christ in the first place? That's the part I'm scratching my head over. They would have had to have future vision themselves to be like, oh boy, this one's really going to bite us in the butt. We better take these ones out of here, else we might be in real trouble with this Christ guy. Like, how would they have known?
Well, okay, I think there's a couple of things here to unpack what I believe Justin is saying here. One is, there's always been a canon debate, obviously, between the Christians over the Old Testament. Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants believe different books should be included or excluded from the canon. Part of it is, I think Justin is saying, there are books that were once considered inspired, which no longer are, and you just don't include them because it proves Christ, one, right? And then two, this is about 100 years after Christ's life, the events being described in this book. So what, charitably speaking, I think what Justin would be saying is that in the interim century, you guys have taken some stuff out.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't the translation of the 70 that took this stuff out a long time ago.
No.
Okay, that's the part that I was having trouble with because I have no idea what the 70 is, when this happened, how this is relevant to the thing.
Okay, the reason why it's relevant is according to the legend, all 70 of them translated the Old Testament exactly the same into Greek, which was considered a miracle, which was considered proof of the veracity of the Septuagint, which the Jews don't accept.
Got it. Okay. So what does the Septuagint have to do exactly with this commentary? Is the Septuagint on Justin's side and the Jews don't like it, or
Yes.
Okay, so the Septuagint has these extra verses related to Christ and
And
then
books of the Bible.
whole books. Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Okay, and then you're saying in the interim century, then the Jews got rid of them. So it's not that they translated verses out a long time ago. It's they translated verses in, and now the Jews have been taking them out.
It would be like saying that you Jews have artificially limited a canon that at that time there were no Christians yet, of course, right? This is
Right.
even before Christianity would have been accepted. But since Christ came, you've done an about face and created a new canon.
Okay.
That,
Okay, yeah. So
that's how I understand
since
it.
Christ came. Now I got a better understanding of the timeline of events. Okay, good.
Okay. And then he says, I mentioned possible interpolation. Justin argues the 95th Psalm prophesies that Christ will rule the world and the nations. Trypho says he is skeptical that such an incredible thing has happened. The incredible thing being the editing of scripture, taking things out, adding things in. Justin says such a thing has happened, claiming he has already shown enough to prove the claim and that he will prove more. Well, I think both you and I would agree he has not shown nearly enough to prove that claim. I'm not convinced that the Jews took these things out, especially how Justin fumbled the ball badly a few videos ago on Old Testament passages.
Yeah, the other thing for me too is I think Justin and the Jew would both agree at the time, Trypho, that's his name, would both agree at the time that Christ isn't ruling yet. And so trying to say the Psalms are prophesying something that neither of them have actually observed yet is also kind of interesting. It's like you took this passage out of the Psalms, which says that Christ is going to rule. And all the Jew has to do is scratch his head and say, yeah, but Christ isn't ruling yet. So why would we have done that? If we just don't think your Christ is the guy, we don't think he's going to rule. And so we just leave it in with our own interpretation since both of you are observing the same facts and he's not king yet, so.
Well, I mean, I guess that's sort of why the conversation goes in the direction that it does towards the discussion of the millennium, which we'll end with. Let's see, 74. Let me go ahead and select that on the screen. Trypho. Why not assume that David in Psalm 95, it's actually 96, but whatever, was referring to God, the maker and father of all things? Justin, the Psalm, when it speaks of his salvation, means the suffering of Christ. Justin argues that this is no surprise that the Jews could not understand, since Moses predicted they would follow after their own lusts and idols. Okay, so the important thing to say here is I actually got to bring up Psalm 96 because I think there's a minor problem here. So the salvation is in verse 3. Proclaim the good news of his salvation from day to day. Now, I think that's a bad place to start if you want to prove that the man spoken of here is Christ, because he says in verse 10, say among the nations the Lord reigns. The world who also is firmly established, it should not be moved. He shall judge the peoples righteously. Now, verse 10 of 96 indicates that Christ will be a judge ruling amongst the nations. And then I think it's in Psalm 72, it says he rules in the midst of his enemies. So I think Justin's looking at the wrong verse in this chapter to determine that this is the Christ ruling. But regardless, that's not really the point of going over this. I'm just saying I don't think Justin is using it in the way that I would to make the same point. 5. Justin argues that in Exodus 23, 20 to 21, God tells Moses he will send his son as a messenger to them for them to obey. In Numbers 13, 16, you see that Moses' right-hand man is Joshua. So in Hebrew, Joshua and Jesus, the same Yeshua, the self-same name of the future angel Messiah. And then Isaiah is cited as saying that those who proclaim the gospel of God are called angels and apostles. This messenger will be born of a virgin. Okay, 76. Justin, Daniel speaks of a kingdom not made with hands, that's from Daniel chapter 2, which is to mean not made by men, but by God. Fair enough. I go with his interpretation this far. Isaiah says, who will declare his generations, which is to say he has no descendant that can be declared. Moses predicts the virgin birth by making reference to the blood of the grapes. Both wine and Christ are made by God. God will banish those who act in his name but reject his son. Oh, yeah. And then Justin adds centipedes to Luke 10:19. Again, Luke 10:19, you tried upon serpents and scorpions. Centipedes isn't in there. I don't know who's adding these things into Luke 10. These additions, and if anybody's adding or taking things away right now, Logos, I think it's the Christians here, because it's not looking good when it comes to the texts that we can actually confirm.
I don't know too much about that. I'm still just trying to follow like the big meta argument going on.
Right. Let me just finish this up. The prophets proclaim the Messiah must suffer and die. Okay. So before I hand it over to you, I don't think the blood of the grapes argument is very good, because, of course, grapes beget grapes. And so just because, God created the first grapes, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have a progenitor to yourself. That's not God. So, grapes beget grapes. So I don't think that's really a good argument. But, while we're at 76, Logos, there's a lot that's been covered. Do you have any questions, comments, clarification?
Yeah, what's the blood of the grapes argument? That's a symbolism I don't understand.
All right, well, let's go here. That's 80. We don't want that. We want 76. 76. Okay, when Moses says that he will wash his garment on the blood of the grapes, does not this signify what I have now often told you is an obscure prediction, namely that he had blood, but not from men, just as not man, but God has begotten the blood of the vine. So the argument seems to be that, well, God begat the blood of the vine. Well, but only in the first act of creation, because, right, you have wild grapes that keep on growing on their own. So
Right.
grapes beget grapes beget grapes. I think that's a weak argument, because only in the first act of creation could you say that the grape didn't have a progenitor.
I'm still missing a lot of things. What is the significance of Moses washing his garments in the blood of the grapes? And what does the blood of the grapes have to do with the progenitor part? Like, I feel like there's a whole bunch of gaps here I don't understand.
Right. Okay. So in the Lord's Supper, Christ says that the wine, which is the blood of the grape, is his blood that he will shed, and that gets into the whole debate about, the real presence in the Eucharist, which that's not what tonight's for, but that's where the connection's being made. Okay. The Last Supper. Okay. And then he's saying that this reference to grapes and blood by Moses can be connected to the Last Supper in Christ.
That seems like a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah, I know. And then also beyond that, it implies he would be born of a virgin.
Okay, make that argument for me. What is I'm trying to get that out of these verses. What is the connection there?
Well, what it seems like the text is saying here is that because God created the grapes directly, and there was God, and then there was the grapes, right? There's no intermediary between that. But that indicates there's going to be God and the Son, and no intermediary between that. But problem is, once grapes were made, they just reproduced on their own.
Yeah, that's true. Also, I mean, maybe I'm still not quite getting the hang of this when we bring it up, but Mary was of the lineage of David, I think is what we said.
Mhm.
And so Christ being put into Mary ostensibly would have the same DNA. And so it seems like there's some physical process. It's not like there's God to Christ with no intermediary. It seems like Mary is at least a partial intermediary, because she is at least giving the lineage of David to Christ.
Yes. So again, I personally don't think that's the blood of the grapes a good argument to run with.
Okay, I think I understand it better now, at least. So thanks for that.
Well, that's why we're here.
Yeah.
Okay, 77. Trypho, how is the born of a virgin, not a young woman, giving birth to Hezekiah? Justin then says, clearly the prophecy states that this one will be before he calls his mother and father, will take before he knows whom to call mother and father, will take the power of Damascus and to spoil Samaria in the presence of the king of Assyria. Such a thing cannot be claimed to have happened to Hezekiah, for the words before he knew how to call mother and father indicate that this was while he would be an infant or a child. Hezekiah might have done this as a grown man, but that is not the order in which the prophecy is stated. Then Justin argues that the Magi represent Damascus and Herod Assyria, and we can see Christ gets these things as a youth. The gift of the Magi, the plunder, right? Gold, frankincense, myrrh. God will often call his disobedient children pagan names. If thy father is an Amorite, thy mother is a Hittite. I think this is an overly allegorical and problematic reading because, to me, it's the straight up reading is this: God's telling the Jews, this big threat you have of like an alliance of Assyria, Israel, and Damascus. It's all good. I'm going to take care of it because the Messiah that I prophesied to you will be way, way, way in the future, long after you've forgotten about this unpleasant experience. I don't think he's talking about the people involved in the other than Christ involved in the nativity. I think God is just saying in the prophecy that, but don't worry, all this stuff's going to be dealt with. Trust me, because the Messiah is hundreds of years down the road. Anything to say on that, Logos?
Yeah. So the thing that strikes me as interesting about this as well is it seems like Trypho. We mentioned this a little bit last time, and now it's even worse. Trypho seems to be caught in like an arm lock here because, on the one hand, let's suppose Justin's reading of this is correct, right? And so we have this this nativity story about Jesus and getting handed all these gifts and so on. Well, if Trypho is a Jew and not a Christian, he's probably skeptical that the story happened exactly as the Christians say the story happened in the first place. Was there really all this gold and frankincense and myrrh, the three kings? Did they really show up? Is there really this, where, is there physical evidence? Is there anything aside from the story itself, which says any of this happened? The problem is Trypho can't make that argument even if he wants to, because that opens the same Pandora's box you brought up kind of last time with the whole zeitgeist thing when talking about parallels with other pagan myths. If Trypho tries to make that argument, the Christian can always be like, well, I mean, now since we're asking for physical evidence, I mean, is there any physical evidence that God parted the Red Sea? Is there any physical evidence that can go through like story after story in the Old Testament that's like the foundation for the Jewish faith? And of course, a Jew is going to be able to predict none or present none in the same way the Christian wouldn't be able to. And so now it's a really interesting dynamic here where the kind of like primacy of historical myths and storytelling that's used by Jews to kind of like cement their faith is now can be used in the Christians. Here's our central myth. I'm not going to ask you for physical evidence. You're not going to ask me for physical evidence. And now here's what your prophecy gets to mean in virtue of my story that happened after the fact. And so that puts them in a really, really nasty predicament.
Yeah, it does. And 78, he goes on more with this. Herod was the king of Assyria on account of his evil ways. Magi who bring gifts represent Damascus coming from Arabia. Well, Damascus is in Syria, not Arabia. So, but also, I don't think I'd say the Magi came from Arabia. I would argue the Magi came from Babylon because the Babylonian priesthood has been called the Magi. But regardless, I think this overly allegorical reading is not helpful. All I think you need to read is all of these threats will be dealt with. Trust me, I'm God, because the Messiah is hundreds of years down the road, and he's going to come. That's, I think, straight up, simple reading. You don't need to go into all this. The foretelling of Christ being born in a manger, which is to say a cave, was copied by Satan in the Mithra legends. The overcoming of Damascus entails that a demon of that place would be defeated, which the Magi who formerly served that demon now served Christ. The power of evil is called Samaria. Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets bad, because if you read about, we'll get into chapter 9. Let's go to 79 now, because it's a continuation. Trypho is angry that Justin argues angels rebelled against God. Justin moderates his tone. He said Isaiah prophesied an evil angel in Tanis would lead the Israelites into rebellion. Tanis is an Egyptian city. He argued that the prince of Tanis is a demon, and he then cites Satan accusing Job before God and his council. the Egyptian magicians through demons were able to counterfeit Moses and his miracles. So Job and the magicians is solid. But the idea that you read prince of doesn't always mean a demon. There's a famous line in Daniel where it says the prince of Persia, who's clearly a demon, delayed an angelic messenger. But we know that the prince in that context is a demon because who else could slow down one of God's messenger angels but a demon? Sometimes a prince is just a prince, Logos?
Yeah.
And then the fun stuff. Trypho praises Justin for using the scriptures. I tell you what, Logos, those darn Protestants better stop interpolating Justin the Martyr.
Wait,
right?
what? Interpret that joke for me. What's going on?
No, because the entire dialogue with Trypho is explicitly sola scriptura.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I was joking in saying that these darn Protestants interpolated Justin the Martyr.
Interpolate. What's that?
That means to change by either adding or removing passages.
Oh! Like we were wondering happened with Ignatius. Was it Ignatius?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
It's a joke because what's the very first thing Trypho says?
Right.
And I remarked to you, sir, that you are very anxious to be safe in all respects since you cling to the scriptures.
Got it. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't catch on. I'm a little tired today, so I had to remember what interpolation was, and then our meta joke about sola scriptura. Got it.
Those darn Protestants, Logos, they rewrote these ancient fathers.
They did. They're just really, really good at
it. Justin follows God in his doctrines, not men in their doctrines. Trypho asks Justin if he thinks Jerusalem will be rebuilt, and the Christian saints, along with the OT saints, will live there with Christ. He says yes, but says that some Christians do not. Justin then says not all who call themselves Christians are Christians. Many deny God by their evil teachings and blasphemies. Read the Gnostics. Justin points to many Jewish sects that Trypho would presumably not accept. All of them as a sign of the confusion at work. Justin then says all right-minded Christians state Christ will rule from Jerusalem for 1,000 years, pointing to prophecies in Ezekiel and Isaiah as proof. So what's interesting about this is, we're at 80. This was hard to square, right? As you pointed out, he says, for if you have fallen in with some who are called Christians, wait, no, that's not it. Or does it admit this truth? I just saw that. Not all Catholics. Yeah, this is the one you wanted. Oh, here we go. I admit to you formally that I and many others are of this opinion and believe that there will take place, as you assuredly are aware. But on the other hand, I signify to you that many who belong to the pure and pious faith or true Christians think otherwise. And that being to his question, will Christ live with them in the patriarchs? But then how do you square that with what he says at the end? Where he says, but I and others who are right-minded Christians on all points are assured that there will be a resurrection of the dead in 1,000 years in Jerusalem. I mean, how do we tie that together, Lucas?
I must have missed it. How we tie it together with what now?
So earlier in chapter 80, as you pointed out, he says that I signify to you that many who belong to the pure and pious faith and are true Christians think otherwise. Think otherwise of what? Well, the question that Trypho asked, the first paragraph.
Got it.
But then Justin says at the end, but I and others who are right-minded Christians on all points are assured that there will be a resurrection of the dead and 1,000 years in Jerusalem. So
I think what he was trying to say in the first verse is there are people who call themselves Christians, but as right-minded Christians, the real ones think this.
But what about the true and righteous ones right here?
Pure, true Christians think otherwise.
But what's the otherwise?
That's a good question.
Because it would appear to be a contradiction.
Yeah, now I see it. Now I see that the block of text what you're saying. Yeah, he can't have his cake and eat it there. If there are pious and true Christians that doubt him on this, then he can't say that all the true right-minded whatever Christians later on believe it. Because
I don't unless he's making a different point, but if you read Trypho's question, Trypho says, do you admit that this place, Jerusalem, shall be rebuilt? And do you accept your people to be gathered there and made joyful with Christ and the patriarchs and prophets, both the men of our nation and other proselytes who joined them before your Christ came? And then he says that, yeah, I do, but some don't. But then he's like, but the right-minded people agree with me. So I'm a little confused as to what's being committed to or not.
I think there's some interpolation going on here, Todd.
I mean, there could be.
I think the middle block of text there is interpolation.
It could be, because when Justin says, all right, yeah, because so when he says controversies, ? We could then just go straight to but I and others who are right-minded Christians at all points assume the resurrection of the dead. Yeah.
I guarantee you that.
I mean, when you have a paragraph like this where he okay, Justin has, well, again, all of this, we have the shadow of interpolation. How much of the Old Testament being badly mangled was Justin or the interpolator? But this is really bad, because we read the apology, we read the second apology, which I think might have actually been a preface to the first. And Justin, see, here's the thing. Those two works, Justin doesn't seem to be nearly as confused as he is here.
Exactly. Yep.
And frankly, that something doesn't smell right. You know, if the two apologies are kind of solid, they're consistent, Justin's not making obvious mistakes, which if you're going to misquote the Old Testament, anybody could compare it, could check you on that. But now we have in the single paragraph two contradictory statements.
And what's interesting is the first one seems like a throwaway statement, kind of just bolted onto the middle of the paragraph. So, like,
yeah,
let's do an experiment, right? Let's suppose I say, then I answered, I'm not so miserable a fellow, Trypho, as to say one thing and think another. I admitted to you formally that I and many others who are the opinion and believe that such will take place, as you surely are aware. Skip the other part. Just say, moreover, I pointed out that some who are called Christians, but are godless, impious heretics, teach doctrines that are in every way blasphemous, atheistical, and foolish. But that you may know I do not say this before you alone, I shall drop a statement, blah, 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 right? So if you just skip that part, the paragraph seems to flow just fine.
Yeah, that throwaway line, with that throwaway line added in, we have three groups. We have a group of Christians who are pious but disagree with Justin. We have a group of Christians who use his name falsely. And then at the end, we have the right-minded Christians who follow Justin. Those are three groups, and the first and the third contradict.
Right. It's just fine if you just think that Justin's talking about, he starts talking about him, then he starts talking about the blasphemers. Moreover, here's more warnings I already gave you about the blasphemers, but all the right people think like me. That's a perfectly coherent, well-flowing paragraph. That extra bit in the middle isn't needed.
Nope.
And it contradicts what he says at the end. So if you just rip that part out, which I guarantee you was added by somebody later on to smooth over some controversy in some ecumenical council or something, it makes sense.
Well, it also is a lot more sus, because if we look at other written material, Irenaeus, who's coming up next after Justin, Tertullian, these are premillennial. Christ rules for 1,000 years. I mean, where I haven't seen the documentation yet for anybody that disbelieves 1,000-year rule of Christ.
Let's take stock of that. Let's see. Who have we gone over that said something about that? I don't think Clement did. I don't think going through who we went over.
So as far as an actual deep dive into the millennium, I think Justin is the first one.
First one.
We know that Polycarp was believed to have taught that by both supporters and critics of the position.
Got it.
Irenaeus said Polycarp taught it, as did Eusebius. And Eusebius didn't agree with that interpretation. Also, there was a guy named Papias who was believed to have taught that by both supporters and detractors from the doctrine. There's no early people. Where are they? I haven't found them yet.
Right.
So the fact that we can't find this group of well-meaning, pious Christians that believe in something other than premillennialism.
At least at the time.
At least at the time, because right, this is supposed to be 130s AD, and then it contradicts what's said later in chapter 80, is very suspicious.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
yeah, Fragments of Papias. That's the one I remember us reading beforehand that talked about this a little bit. Yep.
Yep. A lot of the early stuff was practical because Christians needed to know how to like get on their feet right after the persecutions and Christ leaving. So, but yeah, I don't see these people anywhere.
I don't either.
Not until much later. The earliest known advocate that I can find of something other than premillennialism was a guy named Caius at the end of the 2nd century, so like the 190s, well after Justin wrote this.
Wow.
And again, all of this weird stuff comes from Alexandria. Barnabas's weird woo-woo interpretations of Moses with allegory that was just plainly insane. We went over some of that.
Oh, yeah.
That's Alexandria. So what I think is likely happening here is as the Alexandrian mode of allegorical interpretation, where you just kind of pile on ever more fanciful readings, you run into a problem. You realize that the church fathers that came before you didn't believe this. And if you're going to claim to have an unbroken tradition, you're going to have to do some, manipulation, sort of like the donation of Constantine.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's what's going on.
Okay. The last thing that I want to say before we wrap up here is an interesting question from Delaware D. Does anyone know why the Jews, some sect, didn't try to rebuild the temple after 70 AD? This always seems strange since it was such a major part of their, I think he means of their religion. Maybe there is an obvious answer. Well, the answer is that between 70 AD and then this war that's the backdrop, Bar Kokhba, is that the Jews were expelled from Palestine. They were gone completely, except for a few small scattered remnants, until their return in 1948. So from like 135 to AD to 1948, there weren't Jews living in Palestine, let alone Jerusalem, except for maybe a tiny minority. So they were not in a position to do anything because the Romans had scattered them. And then when they came back, the Muslims had already built the Dome of the Rock. Israel's under siege by all these Muslim nations. The last thing they want to do is incur a jihad of all the Muslims to invade Israel. So that's my answer to Delaware D. Anything you want to add, Logos, before we close this up?
Nope. Pretty good to me.
So, yeah, I'll just say that the church fathers are definitely very interesting. Some of them are a little more fanciful. And I think I'll reiterate this again. There's two things that we've seen in the course of this series. The first part is there's a kind of, well, to use the current lingo from Academic Agent, there's a sensible center position that all of these Christians are converging on. And then there's a few who have imaginative, allegorical readings, which get a little far out there, and also possible accusations of interpolation. And I think looking at all of this so far, and this is a method I think that will be continue to be useful as we go on, is we first look at the sensible center that all of them agree on. And then say, okay, well, that's where we're going to start. And then we'll look at some crazy woo interpretation from allegory, and we'll look at possible interpolation. And that, I think, is the best way to read these texts as any other historical text. Logos.
Sounds good to me.
All right, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Five podcast, signing off.